Thanks a lot. Yeah, I'm sure there won't be peace. Peace is not going to happen, is it? Maybe it will just be a bit more confusing. Okay, so thanks to a few people. Right. Oh, did you want me to go back by the brain?
No, I already
Is that
took
right?
a fabulous
There you
picture
go.
of it.
Okay.
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, so the setup here is basically, I'm just going to assume for the sake of argument that brains are predictive processing machines. And I'm basically just going to ask, supposing they were predictive processing machines, what would that mean for these debates about representation? So what would it mean anyway to be a predictive processing machine? It would mean that you were fundamentally in the business of making predictions of the current sensory input. It would also mean that some of those predictions are positioned to act as motor commands and help to bring about the current sensory input. So that will be important, I think, for thinking about how this goes. This is predictive processing, active inference, as it's sometimes called. My question is just, so what happens to internal representation under these stories? I'm just going to compare different scenarios, all the way from it's all just the same to it's a bit different to there isn't any. Okay. So, would the truth of PP imply victory for the fans of internal representation? Or does it maybe show us quite the opposite, that a good grip on self-organising dynamics is all that cognitive science needs? I think it's in between. So the punchline is, it's internal representation. I think it is. I think these are representation using stories, even in the online case. I think there's some room for debate with Nico there. But it's not internal representation in quite the way that we originally thought about it. And then I also want to say a bit about how PP might alter the landscape of this debate, maybe making peace a little bit more of an option than it was before. So that's the kind of schematic picture. So I'll just talk about conservative predictive processing, radical predictive processing, and actually there's something after radical. There'll be really radical predictive processing that I'm just going to squeeze in there, and then I'll go back to revisit these issues about representation. Okay. So the conservative predictive processing picture, I think, is pretty much the Helmholtz picture. Pretty much I think you get it in Helmholtz, you get it to some extent in Hui. So I'm just learning how to say properly, Hui. So what happens on the conservative view is that what the brain is trying to do is select the hypothesis that best accommodates the current waves of sensory data. Best accommodates those data, given also ongoing estimations of your own uncertainty. So there's sort of various quotes like this. This is a pretty representative one from Gregory. The general notion, Gregory says, is that perceptions are hypotheses of what might be out there. We suppose that bottom-up signals, top-down knowledge and sideways rules combine to generate object perceptions as predictive hypotheses. Perceptions are much like hypotheses of science, filling gaps of data, being predictive to unsensed features and into the future, selected by probabilities and conferring probabilities. So that's kind of what I think of as a sort of conservative picture, the picture that I think Nico, for example, was opposing in the case of online vision. So in Friston-style predictive processing, there's a particular spin on that. I'm trying to do this talk today without actually doing an introduction to predictive processing, so we'll see how that goes. In Friston world, this is given a very particular sort of spin. The selection of the right hypothesis in that world is the result of, and this will be important towards the end, a functionally asymmetric flow of processing. It'll be functionally asymmetric in that top-down and sideways signalling will be encoding predictions, and upwards and sideways signalling will be encoding prediction errors, what's left over after you've applied the prediction to the incoming sensory signal, so the residual error. So that functional asymmetry, I think, will turn out to be a non-negotiable part of these stories, and is the reason, in the end, why I think I'm going to be driven to thinking of them in, broadly speaking, representational terms. But we'll come back to that. Yeah. So the prediction error signal on this story, so that's what gets to flow up and sideways as your top-down predictions meet the incoming waves of sensory data. Glossed according to the conservative story This is the sensory information that is as yet unexplained by the top-down flow of prediction. So it's basically whatever your current best hypothesis about what's out there in the world hasn't managed to accommodate. It's a residual error that's left over after top-down guessing has met incoming sensory evidence. So the prediction error signal then, the stuff that's left over, the unexplained sensory information, is used to select a better overall hypothesis until some level of tolerable error is achieved and you perceive or engage the world. So here's an example. Some people might have seen this, some might not. If you haven't seen it, it probably doesn't look like much. Then I give you some knowledge, you know. Yes, knowledge now, system is permeated with knowledge, and now you can go back to this and it'll look very, very different because, you know, your predictive grip on the sensory input has now been reformulated by that nice flow of knowledge. So we can go back and do that again. So and you could do this with sine wave speech and lots of other examples. This one's less hostage to technical error. So, right. So I actually do think that this does give you a sense of what these stories are trying to say. They're saying, look, there are these waves of sensory information hitting you, and were it not for the top-down predictions that you're bringing to bear, it would be this kind of confusing sort of mishmash of stuff. But bring the right top-down predictions to bear, and that confusing stuff really looks like something. I think that is what we're saying here. So in PP, this whole process is tweaked and nuanced by self-estimated sensory uncertainty. This is the other dimension in these stories, so-called precision weighting of prediction error. How seriously am I taking the current wave of prediction error? How seriously am I taking prediction error in this particular neural sub-area right now? This weights the signal according to how reliable for a task in context it's deemed to be. So this gives you a lot of room for flexibility in these systems. This will be important too. So precision weighting of prediction error varies the balance between the incoming sensory evidence and the top-down prediction according to how reliable you take the incoming sensory evidence relative to your top-down prediction to be. So if you think, hey, you know, I can't really see very much today, it's terribly foggy, you probably don't give very high weighting to the prediction error signal. You might give more weighting to what you know about the room that you're in or something. So it means that there's not a fixed balance, and that's going to be important too, because I think that will bear on these issues about what's online and what's offline, because it will just be a sort of a kind of continuum, and you just shift gently up and down the online-offline continuum according to how much top-down influence is currently being deployed. And that's a very sort of labile part of the equipment here. So this same mechanism, precision estimation, gets to reconfigure the flow of influence between neural areas. That means that these sort of effective connectivity patterns of the brain are reshaped moment by moment in these stories according to estimated uncertainty. So basically the wiring diagram of the brain gets to change moment by moment according to which prediction error signals you're taking seriously. And that's something that you estimate in just the same way as you made the predictions in the first place. So it's the same kind of learning that's involved. This will be important in the end too. It might be worth saying that precision estimation it's a very subtle tool here. You can do a lot of stuff with it, but it's not supposed to be just one thing in the brain. There are lots of different mechanisms of precision weighting and precision estimation, like things like dopamine and phase-lock neural oscillation, stuff that works in different time scales in different ways. So it's one thing that you get to tweak, but there are lots of different ways and time scales at which you might be tweaking it. Okay. So to complete this picture, this is a basic picture, you want to add action. I think there's a very natural extension to action here, and what's important is that action and perception are just sort of inextricably intertwined here. This intertwined account is what Friston and friends call active inference, which never seemed to me to be a very transparent label, but that's what they mean. It's the account in which action and perception are dealt with simultaneously and are intertwined. So their idea is that we've got two different ways to make a current wave of prediction right. One is that you use prediction error, the residual errors, to find a better hypothesis, and that's perception. And the other is that you use the waves of prediction error to change the incoming sensory information, and that's action. So it's kind of two ways of getting rid of prediction error. You either come up with a better hypothesis, or you change the world in order to make the hypothesis that you've currently got correct. So in the case of action, the brain predicts the trajectory of sensations that would ensue were you to perform the action. The idea is then you have prediction error because you're not actually performing the action. You cancel that error out by performing the action. So the prediction of the action entrains the action itself via the same mechanism. So this is making the world conform to the prediction. Okay. So full-blooded intentions to act are now kind of self-fulfilling prophecies. It's got that ideomotor sort of flavour to it. Expecting the flow of sensation that would result were you to move your body so as to keep the surfboard in just the right spot brings about, if you're an expert surfer, the moving of your body so as to get the surfboard in just that right spot. That's a story about action. Putting all that together, you get perception and action sort of locked together in this way that I think is quite interesting, quite inactive in its way. Perceptual hypotheses here inform actions that help to bring about from the world the very streams of perceptual information that they predict. So you're bringing into being the flows of sensory stimulation that you predict. That's kind of an inactive, it's got an inactive flavour to it, I think. You're bringing forth the world that you expect. Might be one way to put it. And I think it's just at about this point that the sort of conservative and less conservative takes on this sort of story begin to diverge. And that's what I really want to look at today. So far that's all been stuff that anyone talking about predictive processing would probably say. Jakob Hui would say that, Tristan would say that. Okay, so I think what we might want to do is ask whether the addition of action makes a fundamental difference to the way we need to think about the information that's being carried by the prediction and the prediction error signal. That's kind of what I want to do. So the conservative view, which I think Jakob represents most forcefully in his 2014 paper that someone mentioned today, this is the self-evidence in brain paper. Yeah, that's Chris. It really suggests that action makes no fundamental difference to the basic Helmholtz-Gregory story. We should still think about prediction error as neurally generated perceptual hypotheses and inferences to the best hypothesis, the hypothesis that best accommodates the current sensory evidence. Prediction error then flags information that is as yet unexplained by a good hypothesis. And sometimes the search for a better hypothesis entrains action. But that's that's almost like a sidebar on the Hui account. Also, and importantly, still according to the conservative reading here, we should see the prediction generating stuff, the so-called generative model, we should see the role of that generative model as in some way recapitulating the causal structure of the world so that the brain becomes, as Hui himself says, an internal mirror of nature. And that's talk that you get from Tristan and you get it from Jakob too. And again, I think that unless you take that notion of mirroring with a huge pinch of salt, you won't get that notion of mirroring out of the more radical versions. As we'll see. So good mirrors, they might say, make the best predictions about the shape and structure of the reflected world. And there too, I think the radical story's going to diverge. Why should we care about these glosses on the underlying math and algorithms? One reason to care, I think, is that if you go with the conservative picture, it can seem opposed to embodied and extended approaches to, or stories about mind. So here's Jakob, quote from Jakob, PP should make us resist conceptions of the mind-world relation, on which the mind is in some fundamental way porous to the world, or viewed as embodied, extended, or inactive. Instead, the mind appears to be secluded from the world. It seems to be more neurocentrically skull-bound and embodied or extended. So, you know, I'm not really going to want that to be an implication of the predictive processing story. And you can see, though, why, if you had the conservative reading, that's exactly what you'd think. Because on the conservative reading, the brain constantly generates hypotheses. The task of them is to explain the sensory data. And they come from a generative model that's trying to recapitulate the causal structure of the world in the head. That does suggest this kind of neurocentric picture in which really it's that recapitulation of the causal structure that gets to do all the real work. what's going on in the head becomes a little replica of the external world, if you like. But I don't think that's the right way to gloss PP. So, as basically plugged the forthcoming book, Surfing Uncertainty, the idea is that the predictive brain is a perfect partner for work on the embodied and extended mind. So, radical predictive processing. The idea here is that action is a kind of game changer, even for what might look like cases of passive perception. So, three things that I think we should get on board for this picture. The first is something like frugality. So the goodness of a predictive model, even within standard sort of mainstream PP, is not just accuracy, it's accuracy minus complexity. So accuracy is the ability to predict the task's salient sensory flux. Complexity is how much sort of muscle power, if you like, cognitive muscle power you use to predict it. So the goal, once you take this sort of approach, is to find the simplest model, the fewest parameter model that will actually serve your purpose, and more about purposes in a minute. So this is sometimes called applying an Occam factor to the prediction task for obvious reasons. Second factor, action-based frugality. So recall that the PP story here has the predictions simultaneously driving perception and action. That means, I think, that once you've got an Occam factor in there, action can be called upon to serve the Occam factor too. That's to say, action can be called upon to reduce complexity. So we'll come back to that in a second. And then there's a third factor, and this is really be another whole talk, so this one won't make a lot of sense yet, but it's like a focus on affordances. So the whole point of the mechanism here really is to prescribe action. Action is the only way to alter sensation. And altering sensation so as to stay viable and alive is really what the whole sort of PP story is about. So action is what prediction error is there to control. That's kind of the important thing, I think. Prediction error isn't there to give you a good hypothesis about the world. It's there to recruit an action that keeps you viable in the world. Okay, so I think that those factors working together actually with another thing which I won't talk about at all, which is the role of interoception, which Anil Seth is pursuing, and this would bring kind of emotion right into the heart of the picture. But I think once you do all those things, you have a really fundamentally different, much more radical picture of the predictive processing economy. Because of all these factors, that economy doesn't commit you to what Michael Anderson calls a richly reconstructive model of what the brain does. So a richly reconstructive model is just one that sort of depicts perception as a way of getting enough information into the system to let it throw away the world. Systems like that reason over inner models, and they use action as a means of implementing the conclusions that they come to. But there's nothing like that in these pictures. And that seems important to me. And I suspect that Howie is sort of, is kind of occupying an unstable place here. So the alternative seems to be to use sensing to deliver an action-based grip on the world. There's going to be a bit of talk about grip as I go along here. Grip is rather popular locution at the moment. So it's not a... The idea would be that you're not using sensing to get a rich world model fired up. You're using sensing just to maintain enough of a grip upon the world to keep these prediction errors, which are in the business of selecting good actions, within certain bounds. So grips like that will almost certainly involve action most of the time. There's a classic example, we probably all know it. Running to catch a fly ball in baseball. It's a classic example from the anti-representationalist, actually. So there's a very simple, efficient strategy for catching a fly ball in baseball. OAC, optical acceleration, cancellation, run so as to keep the ball moving at a constant speed through your visual field. That's the current best contender. As long as your own movements cancel apparent changes in the ball's optical acceleration, you kind of get in the right place to encounter the ball. That's often been thought of as a kind of paradigm case, I think, of a non-representational solution. But I'm going to try and convince you that that there are other ways to think about it. Okay. It is true, though, that in cases like these, behavioural success isn't the outcome of reasoning defined over a little inner replica of the world. It's not like that at all. Instead, want to say the kind of thing that Randy Beer says, that what we're doing here is we're solving the problem by keeping sensory stimulation within certain sorts of boundaries. And if you look at the work on diving gannets and classic work like that, it's got the same sort of flavour. So strategies like that, though, turn out to be really, really compatible with PP. That's because what you're really doing here is you're spotting a context in which a simple model will solve the problem. But spotting a context in which a simple model can solve a problem is actually something that rather complex models can do. So the sort of idea here will be to nest the simplicity within complexity, so that you use quite a lot of interest in world knowledge to spot the simple scenarios in which you can get away without using very much world knowledge. That's the picture. Okay. So the simple strategy here is one that gives a lot of weight into prediction errors that can be minimized by actions that cancel any apparent optical acceleration of the ball. That's the strategy. What that means is that a lot of the representations we're using online, most of the time, will indeed be pragmatic. They'll be about control as opposed to accurate description. So there, that's on that same page with the ecologist. Or as Mike Anderson puts it, the brain is fundamentally action-oriented and specializes in managing the organism's interactions with the world. That's true here, even when you nest those strategies right inside something which is quite heavy-duty. It's quite, recognizing the context as apt for the deployment of a simple low-cost strategy, when you have available lots of higher-cost strategies that you could also use. So you get a whole continuum of possibilities. Better yet, I think, decisions about, how to do that, it itself falls rather naturally to this kind of story. And this will be a whole other talk to do it properly, but the rough idea is that you continuously estimate which strategy best reduces sensory uncertainty for you here and now, the sensory uncertainty that you care about. So you can see examples of this in old work actually by Haruno, Wolpert and Kawato, more recent stuff by Friston and colleagues. It's basically using changes in precision weighting to effectively do strategy switching, to move you from knowledge sparse to knowledge medium to knowledge rich strategies moment by moment. So the thought there is that this apparatus allows you to grab a simple strategy when you need it, but the apparatus itself looks fairly knowledgeable. One way to think about it. And there are some roboticists that are doing some work in this sort of area. Gigliotta, Pizzullo and Nolfi have a nice little robotic simulation. The robot develops what they call an internal model, deployed when sensory stimulation is temporarily unavailable. It predicts the missing stimuli, but not by recreating the scene in any rich way. Instead, it just predicts a few high-level consequences of the missing bits of the signal, which have inbuilt motoric implications which enable the system to get along even in the absence of the thing it's normally responding to. And the integration here is, just as I was describing it, seamless. So you just move between little bursts of model-based and then more driven by the ongoing signal stuff moment by moment. There's a few bits of work like this out there now. I think it's a good way to go. I'll skip that page because I think I said that. So I think that the upshot of that is that PP supports a kind of continuous space for strategy selection. This precision weighting trick, a very powerful trick, allows the system to reorganize itself moment by moment, either into a very simple stimulus-driven system, or into a system that's relying on a bit more on knowledge, or into a system that's relying a lot on knowledge. These don't turn out to be, these are just different sorts of nuances of one system. So architectures like that are dynamically self-reconfiguring. They constantly engage actions that yield new inputs that recruit new effective moment-by-moment architectures. That's got a very dynamical feel to it. I think that I could tell a story that would give us extended predictive minds using this sort of trick. But that's because the strategies that are selected don't have to be restricted to the brain or even the organism. The precision weightings that select a particular a particular set of neural systems and put them in certain kinds of contact right now are thereby selecting actions, and those actions, of course, can fold in any amount of external structure and operations. So apt precision assignments could select strategies that manipulate an abacus and the resulting perception action cycles solve a problem. I think you can probably reconstruct Otto iPhone type cases that way. From that perspective, selecting a sort of temporary set of neural stuff it's the same trick as selecting temporary soft assembled coalitions of neural stuff and bodily stuff and worldly stuff. So it's all being achieved by the same strategy. So I think that the neurocentric take on PP depends on underplaying all that. It trades, I think, upon the idea that I don't think Hui himself even believes that the brain's world model is a whole story. But in fact, the brain's world model is just a little bit of the story here. Okay. So one way to think about this is to ask, let me just jump ahead to a quote from Yakov that might make this a bit clearer. So Yakov says, an agent can grasp and use her phone only because she has a more or less precise and accurate internal representation of the phone. I don't think there's anything in PP that should make you believe that. At least two ways to read it. One would be this. To exploit the phone, you have to represent it well enough to be able to physically engage it when you need it. That's true, but I don't see that working against the extended mind story. Another reading is to exploit the phone, you need to have a kind of reconstructive replica inner world model of the phone and all its contents, so the inner model would now do all the work. That would work against extended mind stories, but I think it's just false. So although there's nothing here that's an argument for the extended mind, I don't think, and this is where I diverge from Yakov, I don't think there's anything here that's an argument against it either. I think these stories are as compatible with an extended mind take on things as any other story that kind of highlights something like dynamical, self-organizing, non-reconstructive approaches. Yeah, and Howie himself is a little bit unstable here, I think. He, in that 2014 paper, he clearly recognizes the role of action, the availability to PP of simple procedural solutions that can be nested within richer knowledge-based structures. Nonetheless, he says, yeah, but still it's all neurocentric. And in the end, I think that's because he's way over-impressed by evil demon scenarios. We won't go into that, but I think, that is my diagnosis. Just far too impressed by the possibility of evil demons. Okay. So far, I think, the upshot is we should resist the thought that the prediction error signal encodes sensory information that's as yet unexplained. We should resist the thought that its role is to recruit a better hypothesis. I think what we should really say is something rather different to that. What we should really say is that the prediction error is sensory information that hasn't yet been leveraged to guide a rolling set of apt engagements with the world. And I think that's true even in passive perception. So even if you're not moving around to engage the world, what the prediction error signal is in the business of doing is, as it were, poising you to do that. It's selecting the kinds of information that would be useful for that sort of purpose. That wouldn't be surprising. After all, as Seth points out, this whole story has its roots in cybernetics, self-organization. What sort of information can the system itself get its hands on? It can get its hands on prediction error. That's, as it were, that's the one signal that you can reliably self-organize yourself around. Okay. So the goal of quashing precision-weighted prediction error isn't to recruit a better hypothesis about the world. I really don't think it is. It's to allow the system to use the sensory signal to better engage the world. Okay, so saying the same thing. So you could talk about this in terms of grip. You could say, look, what we're trying to do here is not mirror the world. This is going to be tricky talk, but certainly not to mirror an organism-independent version of the world. Instead, what you want to do is get a sort of multi-spatial, multi-temporal scale grip upon what's salient about the world for an organism like you. And the signature of that grip is a capacity to engage the world in ongoing cycles in which perception and action work as a single machine to quash highly weighted prediction error. That's a picture in the Surfing Uncertainty book anyway. So that's a picture that I'm calling radical predictive processing. That reworking, I think, it's kind of cosmetic, and it's kind of important. I think it's cosmetic because all of the active inference math is unchanged by it. So, you know, everything that Friston said as far as the math goes, the algorithms, it's all the same. None of that's different. So if that's what you meant when you were talking about inferences and hypotheses and recruiting the hypothesis that best explains the sensory data, then that's fine. But I do think that glossing it the way that I just glossed it helps us see that it's in no way sort of pushing you towards a neurocentric vision. So in the time that's left, I want to ask whether you might possibly be pushed even further. So I've tried to be kind of representationalist about this. So far we've got two ways to describe these systems. So the conservative one, predictions are hypotheses about the way the world is. Prediction error signals sensory data not yet explained by a good hypothesis. Radical version, predictions are recipes for engaging the world. Prediction error is sensory information not yet leveraged to guide or inform those rolling cycles. Third option, obvious what that is by now. Really radical predictive processing. Downward and lateral flowing influence aims to induce recurrent flows that alter the impact of forwards and laterally flowing influence so as to maintain the organism within certain bounds. Basically, these are the bounds of staying alive, viability and persistence, upon which you can build all kinds of other things, like going out for a nice pizza or producing a piece of modern art. But the idea is that it's all basically staying alive. So, which should we prefer? Radical predictive processing or really radical predictive processing? I think what makes this complicated is that I think we've got good reason to think that predictive processing really does depict the brain as in the business of model building, even though the neural model is just part, if you like, of an even bigger model, the embodied model, if you want to call it that. But there's also good reason to think that the contents of that model or model fragment are going to be kind of weird. They're going to be rather alien mishmashes of the stuff that we're used to thinking about. And that might make you think that they're not really well conceived as representational at all. So why alien and weird? First, I think, because there won't be anything reconstructive or action neutral about this. The idea will be that this economy delivers a grip on the sensory features that matter or that might matter for the control of the kinds of action or reasoning, that's the kind of action, that the current situation affords. Also, the inner economy here is very, very inward looking. It works by looking at its own processing again and again. Each level in these stories is trying to learn the patterns that characterize the response at the level below it. That's what it's trying to predict. So each level is treating the level below it as if it were sensory information, in effect, it's trying to get on top of. So it's huge amounts of what you might think of as metacognition, in some sense, in some mild sense. Contents at each level here, it could be indexed by worldly states. You might find out what neurons at some level care about. But that's a really, really indirect pointer. It reveals the kind of patterns of activity at that level in the context of all the rest of the stuff that's going on would be indexing. So it's not, again, there'd be no real reason to think that that's anything apart from a very indirect measure. Also because of this sort of a wormy interweaving of perception and action. I think these really do become just parts of a single machine here. Moreover, that single machine is constantly nuanced by estimates of our own sensory uncertainty. So what's being computed moment by moment is a really odd mixture of stuff. It's a mixture of estimated, partial, task-relevant states of the world, estimates of my own sensory uncertainty, and ongoing recipes for acting so as to alter the sensory signal. I think that Jan Lorewens captures this pretty well in that he says the upshot is that internal representations emerge as not actual representations or duplicates of objects in the world, but incomplete abstract code that makes predictions about the world and revises its predictions on the basis of interaction with the world. So instead of describing how the world is, even at the higher levels, I think these models are about engaging the world. They're about generating recipes for action. Okay, skip that. So this really almost echoes Mike Anderson's vision, where he says we should understand brains as action control systems, recenter our notion of cognition around affordances, move away from the reconstructive model of thinking offered by prevailing computational approaches to the mind. I agree with everything there apart from, as it were, that comma, probably, the identification of representation centricity with reconstructiveness. So the inner states are not passive reconstructive, but are they really non-representational? A few quick, and they will now be quick comments on that, and then I'll stop. Most important one, I think, is that I don't see any way to understand these stories apart from in terms of some sort of really important functional asymmetry between what are normally called predictions and prediction error signals. Obviously, describing them that way threatens to beg a few questions here, but I don't think you can be on top of these systems without thinking that there's a functional asymmetry that matters. If there's no deep asymmetry here, then I think this is just a failed empirical account. If there's not a deep asymmetry between two kinds of signal that the brain's computing, one of which is broadly in the ballpark of residual error, and the other is broadly in the ballpark of prediction, these stories are just wrong. So that means, I think, that you need something that's compared to something so as to deliver something that would pretty well be lost as residual error. There's no other way to think about this. And residual error here, it's not a simple quantity. It's quite a complicated quantity. It's a prediction errors are as structured, targeted, nuanced in their implications as the predictions relative to which they're being computed. That's why, in a way, they do duty here for forward-flowing sensory information. The prediction error signal just is the sensory information that's left over after you've been met by this signal, however you choose to think about it. So I think that's already pushing us in the direction of a representational reading. Similarly, you can't get rid of the core notion of a probabilistic generative model. At the very least, that means something that's capable of generating mock sensory data for itself using, I want to say here, stored knowledge about the world. At the very least, it's got to be capable of generating mock sensory data for itself. You know, maybe Nico wants to leave off that last bit, but it's got to be able to generate mock sensory data for itself. And that directly underpins the PP accounts of imagery, recall, offline reasoning, and so on. So the fact that that's the very thing that's also involved in online stuff seems to put some pressure on a sort of thin reading of the online stuff. So conceptually, I think this is still a thoroughly content-involving vision. Predictions, obviously, and prediction error signals, less obviously, look to have determinate contents. And I think that's true at every level. It's also true that PP architectures are really great at omission-related response. I think there's probably an argument here. I've never managed to make it quite properly, but it kind of feels to me as if you can have omission-related responses of arbitrary complexity, you're really in a sort of representational ballpark. So there are simple cases. You know, I can find a missing tone salient. Tone was predicted by the model, it didn't happen, big prediction error. But I can find any kind of omission salient. It's not just a missing tone. I could have a missing card from a poker hand, a missing face from a family album, a missing prime number from a series of primes. The fact that you've got a grip here on omission-related responses of arbitrary complexity makes me think that that's a representational system. I don't know how else to conceptualize a grip on omission-related responses of arbitrary complexity. Omissions can surely only be calculated relative to bodies of expectation. That means I think they require models, and those models have to be issuing specific predictions. So it's possible that model talk here turns out to be cheaper than representation talk. I don't know, that would be one way to go. You say, okay, I'll give you all this, you need models, but somehow you don't need representations because I was a Fodorian about representation and you haven't got those. You could say that. Could you keep this vision while ditching the whole idea that predictions have contents and ditching the idea that prediction error signals are residual errors calculated relative to those contents? Well, you could, and if you did ditch that, then what you would have is a picture, I think, of complex and mysteriously asymmetric loop-in dynamics spanning brain, body, and world. But you wouldn't know why they're asymmetric. You would kind of lose your grip on, as it were, the rationale behind the asymmetry, I think. So in sum, the thought is these are knowledge structures, they're just not quite as we knew them. And finally, notice that if you sort of tell the stories this way, nothing really turns very directly upon our abilities with offline cognition. And they were the mainstay of a lot of earlier debates here, maybe they still should be. But I think PPs kind of alters the landscape here, so that the online-offline distinction seems a lot fuzzier than it did before. Neural states in these stories, even the online ones, can influence behaviour and thought both in what you might think of as highly top-down knowledge-driven mode and highly input-driven mode, highly sensory evidence-driven mode. That will just vary according to your current estimations and weightings of precision. So the online-offline distinction doesn't seem clear-cut here. It's just different balances of the same old basic processing. You could have online cases where you're bringing huge amounts of stored knowledge to bear. And you could have some offline cases where you're not bringing huge amounts of stored knowledge to bear. I think it's harder to get that one. I think it also suggests a new way of thinking about the debate between model-based and ecological, because this is a continuous space. So it's not really a choice between model-based and ecological, it's every possible point in between and a neat way of moving among them, which I think might be attractive. So, yes, I'm nearly done. I think if radical predictive processing is right, then it's a whole embodied active system that self-organises around this nice quantity prediction error. I think people are right nowadays to say this delivers a grip upon the evolving sensory barrage. It's a grip that helps to determine perception and action, brings about the ongoing stream of sensory stimulation itself. I like all that talk about grip. I think it's capturing something really important. It captures meshing together perception, cognition and action. But I don't see it as an alternative to thinking about that grip as, if you like, rooted in a model-based grip, a model-based take on the world. So grip, I think, is just a new representation. That's it. That's the end. Thank you.